All right, hello. Oh, all right, hello everyone. Welcome to my show. I'm Dr. Andrew Kaufman, and this channel is called Medicamentum Authentica. Today is April 3rd, 2020, and I have some very special guests I'd like to introduce to you. We have Dawn Lester and David Parker, the author of this excellent, well-researched book that I encourage you all to check out. They have done a couple of interviews lately and uncovering a lot of the fallacies and poor scientific conclusions in the medical community and in our medical system. And today we're going to talk about a very relevant topic to what's going on. We're going to be talking about viruses and germ theory. I'm very hopeful that this discussion you're about to see will clear up many of the questions that you have about these topics. I have been inundated with emails and messages with all kinds of questions about this, and I think this is going to be as close to a possible definitive response. And I encourage everyone out there to read further and do your own research and decide for yourself what you think about this issue. So, welcome, David and Dawn.
Thank you very much, Andy, for having us on your show. We're looking forward to this as well.
Yes, definitely.
So, what I was going to do, unless you have any objections, is for your listeners who obviously don't know us, is to just give a very brief reason as to why we wrote the book in the first place. And this came around really because of years ago personal experiences within certainly my family. I have spoken about this before with various close family members and close friends who were diagnosed with various cancers. And they all, as we all thought, you take the standard medical advice and take the standard medical treatment and do everything that the physicians asked them to do. And unfortunately, all 6 people died. And this sort of came to a time when the medical establishment were always saying how much success they were having with cancer in fighting it, and things were getting better, and they were sort of having a 50% success rate. And I'm thinking, well, that doesn't correlate with my own personal experiences where they've had a 100% failure rate. So that was probably the first big hit, because it's quite emotional too, as to that there's something wrong with the medical establishment's treatment, and also in what we're being told by the government and the medical establishment. It didn't correlate.
Right.
So,
well, David, if I may interrupt for a second, that's a really excellent point. And earlier in my career, I was a physician assistant, and I worked in Department of Hematology and Oncology for 2 years, and I took care of patients with all kinds of cancers, focusing on cancers of the blood system. And I share the same exact experience. There was almost no one who survived.
Sure. And the little other interesting point to this was another relative who was an elderly lady who was also diagnosed with cancer. And but she flatly refused to, as she put it, be messed about by the medical establishment.
Good for her.
Quite a strong-minded
Exactly.
elderly lady, and she refused anything at all. And she said, "I'll just get on with it, and what happens, happens." And over a period of a year or two, because they still monitored her to see how she was getting on, and I guess after about 2 years, they were able to say that, so your cancer's actually completely disappeared. And she lived a nice, healthy life into very old age. So,
Wow.
all of this added to, I was thinking, well, this is very strange. All the people in my family and friends who followed the medical establishment died, and the one that didn't is still alive. So that's really what sort of kicked it off. I thought there's something wrong. There's something very wrong. So Dawn and I were writing another book, which was absolutely nothing to do with the medical establishment whatsoever. But there was a section in it where we needed some information about viruses. And so we thought, well, we don't know a great deal about it at that time, and we're going back some years now. So we'll have a look into it. And the first thing that I guess that we really came across was that there was a controversy over HIV/AIDS. which we didn't know about. We didn't know there was any controversy at all. But the more we looked into it, the more we thought, this was not a clear-cut case. There was quite a lot of high-powered, if you like, educated people. I'm thinking of like Peter Duesberg, Dr. Peter Duesberg, and others that were saying, there's something very wrong with this. We don't think, it doesn't believe there's a virus at all that's causing AIDS. So that was our first wake-up call, if you like, when we thought, oh, okay, well, we'll look into this. And Dawn and I decided right from the outset that we would not take anything for granted. We'd look for the evidence. We wouldn't take anything that anyone said in authority unless we could find the evidence to support it. So that was really what kicked off the present book, which was we thought, well, we'll ask the most basic question of all, which is, well, what really makes you ill? Hence the title of the book. And we continued our research on that to look, not to just, if you like, attack the medical establishment. That wasn't in our minds at all, because we knew doctors and nurses, some family members, and we knew that they were always trying to do their best. They were following the rules, they were following the guidelines, they were following their education. But of course, if what you're being taught is wrong and you don't know, then you're doing the best thing, but it's not going to work out right. And of course, that's what's really been happening. So we thought, right, well, we won't take any of that for granted. If we can find evidence to support what's being said, then fair enough, whether it was about viruses, bacteria, vaccinations, whatever it was. But we wanted to see the evidence. And it was a big surprise to both Dawn and I that we couldn't find it anywhere. We got led down all sorts of tracks, but the real hard evidence, any proper primary scientific papers, were just not there. And we came across other people who looked the same, such as Carrie Mullis, who people may remember invented the sort of PCR, which he won a Nobel Prize for. And he's on the record of saying, that he did exactly the same for the HIV AIDS, the virus. And he said the scientific papers are not there. And coming from a guy like that, unfortunately he's not with us anymore, but coming from a guy like that who knows what he's talking about, we thought, yeah, we're really onto something here. It's a big thing that we're having crammed down our throats, if you like, worldwide. When it first came up in the 80s that, it was going to be such a pandemic, word we've heard a lot of just lately, millions are going to die sweeping across the world and we're all doomed, type of thing.
Yeah, well, David, if I may interject something. So
sure.
actually, Carrie Mullis was the first person I heard and talk about the questionable origin and scientific evidence for HIV as well. And it just occurred by accident. I was looking at a totally different issue that Carrie Mullis also was talking about, and it was quite surprising to me at the time. And of course, I immediately did some further investigation. But going back to my medical training to help echo what you were saying before, I think there are two significant things about how they train doctors, at least in the United States. And one thing is that they have told us as medical students, and right from day one, that 50% of what they were going to teach us about medicine is going to turn out to be false in 5 years. And, that's a pretty bold statement. And I think people interpreted it as meaning that there's going to be better and better treatments and it's going to improve, but that's not really what they meant. And I think, you can look at John Ioannidis' article in PLOS One talking about how most published research findings are false. And I think that's really what they were talking about. But when they taught us about different diseases, including, infectious disease and many others, they told us what caused the disease, but they never presented the evidence of how that was discovered. They just said basically that it was a fact, and all of the other knowledge that we were taught was built on those fundamental principles that we never investigated the scientific basis for. So the fact that you were able to look at this problem and say, you know what? Is there really this primary scientific evidence to show that these are the causes of illness is such a brilliant way to approach it, because if if there isn't, then it would crumble down the whole body of knowledge, because if it's built upon a false foundation, it cannot stay erect.
Exactly, exactly. And this is what we found. And the more we looked, and we tested our hypothesis. We thought, well, the more we look, the less we're finding any evidence to support what the medical establishment say. So we looked at various diseases. We took some of the biggies to start with, and looked for the evidence for either bacterial or viral causes. Couldn't find any. I mean, we can talk about this in more detail. We do, of course. I might add, explain it in our book in detail. That's why it's nearly 800 pages.
Right. Well, could you give an example of an illness that our audience would be familiar with in the infectious space that was really surprising what you learned about it?
Well, one possibly is, and again, I don't know if it's being compared to now, but the what's called Spanish flu, 1918 flu. Everyone says, oh, it's caused by a virus, and it was one of the most deadly, and there's millions of people died. And I mean, that's one of the puzzles when you look at it, that some of the figures say, oh, 10 million, 20 million, some say 100
Right.
million. But then when we started looking, we found some writings of people as sort of contemporary or sort of soon after. We found some writings where, I mean, at the time they thought, first of all, it was bacterial. Then they couldn't find bacteria, so then they thought it was viral, or they said it was viral. But everyone says, oh, it was influenza. But the
Right.
more we
Well,
go on.
Dawn, that's there's a parallel to the COVID-19, because when the first people were sick in Wuhan, China, they first thought it was a bacterial illness and treated them with antibiotics. And
Yes.
then when they did not recover, then they made the leap that it must be a virus. So it's like the same exact paradigm as was 100 years ago.
Yeah.
Yes, and they, again, it was a worldwide phenomenon. Millions of people died, although. But one of the things, of course, that is conveniently left out of the discussion is the fact that that was at the tail end of a pretty horrendous, 4 year. I know it wasn't 4 years for the Americans, but it was the end of a 4-year war. But also when people say, oh, 1918 flu, we discovered that there were there were health problems that started earlier and it carried on later. So it wasn't just that 1 year. But when we sort of digging into various reports, all kinds of documentation of the time or soon afterwards, finding that there were multiple illnesses, there were various different people were affected, or different areas of the world were affected differently. So one of the writings was from, I don't know if you're familiar with Eleanor McBean, The Poison Needle.
Yes.
Right. Okay. Well, she describes some of the problems, and in one of the, I believe it was one of the American camps, thousands of American soldiers were dying soon after, surprisingly, receiving vaccines, because they were given loads of vaccines.
Wow. So they had a Spanish flu vaccine at the time?
No, vaccines for all kinds of things, typhoid or whatever.
Oh, right. Smallpox and diphtheria, I think, is
Yes,
Yeah.
they were
they had
given.
at the time, right?
Yeah, they were given a number of vaccines pretty much at the same time. So, there are parallels again with Gulf War syndrome.
There was even,
So the Gulf War, they're given lots of vaccines, and so
Right.
that can be attributed to, so that the soldiers dying in the camps could be attributed to that. But that's not the case for everyone. So there were different places around the world where they're claiming that it's all part of the flu. And yet when you actually start looking into what was going on, the evidence isn't there that it's flu, that people were ill, but we found lots of other reasons, one of which I can't remember the title of it's a long article, but about aspirin. So that was actually causing people to have really serious respiratory problems because they were giving aspirin in very high doses. So
Right.
that's in a paper. I can't remember.
Right. they've always taught us in medical school that aspirin can make asthma worse. So perhaps it's a similar mechanism to that. So it seems like you're saying actually that the Spanish flu may have not been one illness, but it may have been a combination of different illnesses. And that there's really no evidence that there was an influenza virus causing it. So Dawn, maybe you can introduce to us, like, how, if you were a scientist or a health researcher, how would you go about proving that a virus was responsible for causing an illness?
Well, I think to our sort of simple minds, if you like, you've got, as we said right at the beginning, you've got to sort of follow the evidence and see what proof you've got. One is identifying that a virus, any virus, these sort of tiny particles, which they only discovered once they'd invented the electron microscope, which I think, just in case any of your listeners are in any doubt, these are not the nice big 3D moving pictures that you see on the media. You know, those are just computer generated images. That is not what you see down an electron microscope. They're just black and white, you would see, and certainly not moving. So we would want to see that someone could actually prove that whatever the particle was that they were identifying as the cause of the particular illness, and this goes for any virus, is that they have some proof to show that it's actually invading cells and actually destroying cells in some massive way to cause an illness, and for this to be written up scientifically. And it's that information we were looking for, primary papers that proved conclusively that they'd got a virus which was fully categorized and described and had definite proof that it was the cause of whatever disease they were specifying. Mm-hmm. And it's those papers that we've never caught sight of, and Carrie Mullis was referring to with HIV. Right. They're not there for any of these cases. So it's surmising. There seems to be a lot of it is just built on people are one is misinterpreting what data they've looked at and then making suppositions from those misinterpretations.
Right.
It's 2 and 2 makes 5. And I think that's why your latest piece of work on exosomes is so important, where obviously there's more information available now, but I think people are still making those basic mistakes of misinterpreting what they see, right, and making it out to be something else.
Right. So you're saying that you have not found any experimental evidence from research papers that they've actually had people ill with an illness like the flu and been able to show in that person that they could isolate and purify a virus out of the sick people, and they would not be able to isolate that out of healthy people, right? And then they would be able to show that that virus particle was actually responsible for damaging tissue in the body.
Correct, yes.
And that there's no evidence of that for the flu or, in fact, any other virus that is told to us that causes illness.
Correct, yes. Yes.
One of the things that we did, as I suggested with, the 1918 flu, is that we went back to, well, what does, questioning what does the word virus mean, and realised that it comes from the Latin for poison or noxious substance, and because obviously looking at illnesses and took us to the vaccination topic, which is, there's so much connected. So we looked at some of the very original work and reports about the work of Edward Jenner, and a lot of material that was written by a number of eminent scientists and doctors at the time that looked into the topic of vaccination and called it a superstition. They called it a fraud, a hoax. So a lot of those papers, eminent physicians. There was Dr. Charles Crichton, who at one point was asked to write the vaccination article, I think, for the Encyclopaedia Britannica of 1890 something, I think. So, we're going back a long way.
That was before Wikipedia, wasn't it?
Oh, yes. Yes. Encyclopedia Britannica still, got,
Still around.
Yeah, it's still
Yes.
around. Obviously not used as much as Wikipedia, but at the time he was very much pro-vaccines. There weren't that many at the time, but again, he was pro-vaccine. But instead of just writing the standard explanation of vaccination for his article, he decided to go back and have a look at it. And when he actually looked at the science behind it, he said there is no science behind vaccination. He called it a superstition. Others have called it a fraud around the same kind of time. Now, the point of vaccines, not originally to prevent against viruses in the same way it is now. It was to, induce a mild form of the disease, which was supposed to protect you against a more virulent version.
Right.
It's been used, obviously, since they had the electron microscope and were able to find these smaller particles. But so much of the literature of that kind of time, when they were freer to talk about these things, shows that not only was vaccination regarded as a superstition and not based on science, but some of those same doctors, I can't remember the names off the top of my head, but some of those same doctors had looked into the germ theory, and they said the same thing, that there is no scientific basis for the idea that any germ causes any disease, which was quite astounding. And these again are, medically qualified doctors of the early 20th century, thereabouts, and they were pretty much, they have been pretty much kind of put to one side. It takes some digging to find this kind of information. And you say, how did we look? Well, we've spent a very long time preparing preparing the material. So it's, I can't tell you how many hours, hundreds of hours we've spent, really, reading all these kind of documents. And if in the early 20th century there's no scientific basis for the idea that for the germ theory, and no germs have been shown to be the causes of any disease, if that was the case in the early 20th century, it's still the case now, because nothing's changed.
So this is really incredible stuff. And something occurred to me while you were talking, because there are very small particles that you can see in the electron microscope, right, that have been labeled as a virus. But it's very important, the power of language, because if you take those particles and you don't know what they really are, but you apply the term virus to them, that automatically makes them the bad guy. Right. Absolutely. And my understanding is that the term virus was actually used in medical research before the advent of the microscope, and they even knew that any microorganisms existed. Right. And it's sort of akin to the concept of miasma, which is some kind of foul substance in the air, right, that can cause disease. And certainly we know that air pollution is such a thing, right? And we know about black mold that people have in homes, right, that has some kind of toxic particle or substance in the air that we breathe that makes us sick. So there is some certainly truth to that has been shown scientifically. So I think this is a good segue into talking a little bit about germ theory and Koch's postulates. So let me ask you, what was the actual evidence that supported the initial idea of the germ theory?
Well, I think, we're going back now probably about 150 years, something like that. Well, it does actually go back further, but most people think of it in terms of originating with Louis Pasteur, who I'm sure most people have heard of.
Right. But Louis Pasteur, all of his ideas were stolen from someone else, weren't they?
Pretty much. And it's good to remember that he was a chemist, so he wasn't a doctor, he wasn't a proper scientist, really.
Whereas Antoine Béchamp was.
Yes, a contemporary who was a scientist, and he knew pretty much that the things that Pasteur was putting out were unfounded. But like in all these things, people latch onto it who see that there's a way to make some money, and that's exactly what happened. But that's a bit more of a longer story. But suffice it to say, at the time when people were looking as to what could be possibly making people ill, and they were able with their optical microscopes to examine the blood. And first of all, they could only see what we now know as bacteria. And it was while they were looking at bacteria that they made the first fundamental mistake, really, because they would see in the blood bacteria clustered around probably dead or dying cells, and made the basic mistake of the bacteria were the cause of the dead and dying cells, rather than realizing that they're actually part of the body's cleanup system. And so we often liken it to people seeing firemen around a burning house and then blaming the firemen for the fire.
Wow. So the firemen are like the bacteria in this example, right?
Yeah. If you misinterpret what you're seeing, which is what has been done, certainly with bacteria. And so they got labelled the bad guys because it was misunderstood what they were doing. But cutting a very long story short, that was the first basic mistake. But then they realised they couldn't attribute everything to bacteria at the time, so they guessed that there must be something else, but they couldn't see it. And it wasn't until about the 1930s, when the electron microscope was invented, that they could then see smaller particles in the blood, which then got the misnomer, rather than the word virus meaning a toxic substance.
Right.
The particles got called viruses, and they were labelled the bad guys ever since. And obviously the pharmaceutical companies have found these very useful things
Right.
Invent new ones and blame them on just about everything you can think of.
David, when early on, when they realized that not all diseases had bacteria associated with that under the microscope, they were routinely using medicines made of mercury and arsenic in that era. And we now know that those are extremely toxic substances, especially to the central nervous system, but actually to all of our body systems. Did they ever consider that some of the illness may be actually caused by their own medications?
Well, they don't seem to have done, because, in those days, obviously, for many years, things like syphilis was prevalent in certain quarters.
Hundreds of years.
And, the doctors of the time were treating syphilis with sort of mercury potions and ointments, which you think, now we may laugh at it and think, well, crikey, that's a recipe for disaster. But this was the medical establishment. They thought that was quite a useful thing to do. So, yes, in many instances, and we may move on to it, the treatment is worse than the disease that they were supposed to be treating. I mean, and we had a very similar parallel, didn't we, with the onset of HIV/AIDS, where certainly in the early days in the 80s, where they started treating people with very high dose AZT, which, there are many people now have looked at it and they realise that all the people they treated with that particular dose of AZT all died. And we've come across some doctors, some German doctors, that admit that it was the AZT that killed them, and
Right.
So that's been happening a lot. And I often like to quote Napoleon, people might not, where he said to his physician that one day it will be discovered that you physicians are responsible for more deaths than all us generals put together. And I think that's a very interesting quote.
There is another, there are actually quite a lot of parallels between syphilis and HIV with the tests. Just the way they tested and what they were testing for.
Right. Because the test is an antibody test. It's not a culture of the bacteria that they say causes syphilis, correct?
Sure.
And syphilis has got has been recognised as something that's not necessarily got a significant kind of set of symptoms. There's again a particularly useful small booklet by Herbert Shelton, who was a doctor of chiropractic who has written a book, Syphilis, is it a I can't remember the full name, but he's quite detailed in how he describes a lot of the way they were testing for syphilis. I mean, they'd test a whole family, not because they thought it was sexually transmitted, but because they thought that children of parents who had syphilis would be defective. So they were presenting this test, the Wasserman test. Presumably, yes, Wasserman test. Okay. And also, and if people who wanted to get married, particularly in America, I believe this was the case, that if the people who wanted to get married had to have the test and have a negative test result.
Right. And I think that's still true.
Really?
Yeah. Well, wow. I believe it was when I got married earlier in my life.
Yeah.
Wow. But the thing is that there's a story of somebody who received a positive test and who was so devastated he committed suicide, and soon afterwards he got a note from the medical people telling him that the test result was wrong and he was actually negative.
Wow.
I mean, those kind of things are
right.
heartbreaking, and you think, no, that's a huge mistake to make.
And as we all know who've looked into it, there's some direct comparisons with that and the HIV test, which
Absolutely.
has been shown by many people to be totally unsatisfactory and totally reliable. But of course, getting a positive test can devastate people's lives forever once they're tested HIV positive. But it's based on no sound science whatsoever.
Right. Well, so I think that's a really important point to drive home, that these interactions with the healthcare system can have a really profound effect on people's lives. And, the HIV test is particularly problematic because there are over 50 conditions that can give you a positive result. And some of these are extremely common, like receiving a hepatitis B vaccination, being pregnant after the first time, right, for subsequent pregnancies. And so these, almost everybody has these experiences and then could end up having a positive HIV test, which can change the rest of your life.
Sure.
Right.
Yeah. So it really, and this is sort of a worrying, has worrying consequences for what's probably going to be happening around the coronavirus thing, where they're officially putting tests together based on PCR, which again, people should remember, Carrie Mullis, the inventor of PCR, has said this is not what it was designed for. This is going to give you inappropriate tests and unreliable tests, and yet they're going ahead and doing it. And I'm pleased to see on your presentation, I think you do mention that. And you can see what's going to happen. People are going to line up for their tests and they're going to be told, oh yes, you're positive or whatever, and then they're going to, all sorts of dire consequences are going to come out of that, not least of which might be this new vaccination that they're feverishly trying to put together, which we may not get time today, but vaccinations are a whole subject on their own, and just what's in them and what their benefits are, which are none, as we found.
Well, David, I would definitely like to do a subsequent discussion about that issue, because that's something that I've also talked about and done quite a bit of research on. But let's get back a little bit to the germ theory, because it occurs to me that when dealing with bacteria are pretty easy to work with in the laboratory. We know how to grow them, right? And we can, like you said, demonstrate that bacteria are present in various diseases that we have, right? Like everyone knows about strep throat, that you could easily take the Streptococcus bacteria out of someone and grow it in a culture. So wouldn't it be a pretty easy experiment to do, to just take that bacteria that we think causes a disease and put it in a healthy person's body, and they would get the same disease, right?
Well, this, of course, has been tried, because this is sort of Koch's postulate. His first postulate really says that anyone with a certain named disease should always exhibit the agent, the germ that's causing it. But there's many instances where, and that's a sound thing, that's a sound thing to do. But there are many instances where that doesn't occur. So someone can have the disease prescribed by the medical establishment, and the germ that is supposed to cause it is not present in their body. So you realise straight away there's something wrong, and the converse of that, So
You mean that the germ is in their body, but they're not sick?
yes,
Yes.
you can have that, and that they're sick and they don't have the germ in their body. So it makes a nonsense of the whole thing, really. But this is, of course, another one of the flaws that we found within the lack of science, if you like, and the teachings of the medical establishment.
That's right. Well,
What
the
I've
example, 1 second, Dawn, the example
Yeah.
about strep throat that I mentioned,
Yeah,
I never questioned that initially, but in recent years, when people are starting to wake up and recognize about the microbiome, that we have healthy bacteria and they're actually crucial for our body to function and for us to survive, well, one of those normal bacteria is streptococcus.
yeah,
So how could it be a normal bacteria and then also cause disease occasionally?
yes.
Exactly.
Well,
Go on.
sorry, this is one of many anomalies that we came across where stuff that's in your body all the time, and sometimes it's okay and sometimes it's not, which is a nonsense, and it goes quite against Koch's postulates, which are supposed to be some of the sort of bywords of the medical establishment. And yes, there's all sorts of things that like that, and all sorts of examples which we do put in the book so that people can see for themselves the inconsistencies, contradictions, and plain nonsense that. Well, and this is why we came to the conclusion that medicine, as practiced in Western medicine, is not a science. It's more a dogma, more a belief system. It's not based on sound science. That's not, of course, what you're told. We're all told that it is a science, but when you look into it, and believe me, this was a shock to us, because we always grew up thinking it was a science, but it's not. And I'm just trying to think of the doctor's name, the
Yes.
medical heretic.
Robert Mendelsohn.
Dr. Robert Mendelsohn.
If I can,
He wrote quite an interesting book as a practicing doctor with a large profession, and he said it's more akin to a religion than it is a science, and that's
Wow.
coming from a doctor.
Yeah, that quite is. What did you want to add, Dawn?
No, if we can go back to when you were saying about the strep throat, you said if you put the bacterium into a healthy person, the thing that needs to be done first is to actually test the healthy person if they have that particular bacterium present in the first place before you put the bacterium into their body. So just because you find it after you've got, not you, but after it's been theoretically put into the person, they might already have that. I mean, the Staphylococcus as well is another one that is found commonly on the skin, various parts of the body in healthy people, and yet it's supposed to be part of one of these superbugs, the MRSA. And again, how can something that is found in healthy people be something that causes disease? Because by definition, if it causes disease, it must cause disease in every case. Koch's first postulate. So if it doesn't cause disease, if it can be present without causing disease, it cannot be the cause of disease. And so we work with logic, and we think that's common sense, that's logic. How can it be twisted? Oh, well, sometimes it might. And so when we find these anomalies and think, well, sometimes it might cause disease, and in certain circumstances it might cause disease. But what are the circumstances? And we kept looking and reading. What are the circumstances? They don't explain it,
Right.
or they don't. It's just not there.
It sounds like a very convenient justification, doesn't it?
Sure.
Oh,
Yes,
it works, because it certainly works to blame viruses and bacteria, because the real causes, the things that really cause illness, are things that are normal to everyday life. And of course,
Right.
that makes lots of money for all these different industries, which we'll may go into at another time. But again, it's convenient to.
Right. Well, I'm just thinking you could say, okay, so let's say that there's a thunderstorm, right? And some people get the symptoms of an illness occurring the same day as the thunderstorm. Well, you could say that the thunderstorm caused the illness, couldn't you?
Yeah.
Right? And then if you said, well, what about all the people who didn't get sick from the thunderstorm? Well, you'd say, oh, well, because it only makes you sick some of the time. There are other factors involved,
Or,
right?
or that they have natural immunity, which is another favourite thing they come up with. But yes, they're great at coming up with excuses, but again,
Not explanations.
unsubstantiated. And this is what we were looking for all the time. Well, we believe, well, if you can make a statement, but that's your theory. But if you're proposing the theory, then it's important that you can also prove what your theory is. And I always like to mention the philosopher Bertrand Russell, who once said otherwise. It's akin to me saying, him, Bertrand Russell, I believe that there's a chocolate teapot orbiting Mars, and you've got to believe me unless you can prove it's false.
Right, right. Well, this is a really, really critical issue because, I've been talking about some of the same concepts that we're discussing today, and there's a lot of people that want to have a nice explanation for, well, it seems like people pass disease to each other through contagion, right? And that is totally built upon this idea that there's an infectious agent that causes the disease, and then we somehow pass that back and forth between each other. And in some ways, based on our personal experience, it does seem like that may occur because, it might be several people get sick at the same time in our family or in our child's classroom, right? But there easily could be many, many other explanations for that as well. But since we have this belief that there's an infectious germ causing the illness, well, it makes a nice explanation. But what I'm trying to tell people is that it doesn't really matter if contagion is true or not, because if there's actually no germ causing the illness, it doesn't matter, right? Because in order to understand it, you have to then go back and find out, well, what actually is causing the illness? And then see, well, how do you get that? And does it make sense that that could pass from person to person? Or does it come from a common source? Right? Or is it part of some kind of biological program that is a normal function in some way?
Well, the contagion stroke infection question is something that comes up quite a bit when we're talking to people, and we'll always get little stories about their little Johnny, shall we say, goes to a party at someone's house, and all the kids mix together, and they all come down with measles or chickenpox or something like that. So therefore, they think contagion or infection must be a fact. And our sort of answer to that is that, first of all, as we show in the book, if you take away the fact that there are no bacterial or virus causes of disease, that cannot be proved. So we're not denying that, okay, all the kids get ill, let's say, or a high percentage of them. So therefore, there must be some other factors, which obviously we can't be aware of. We'd have to know what their environment is, what their food and drink is, what their medicine and vaccine schedules are, to be able to stand any chance of being able to put a guess together as to what makes them ill. But we also, and I've sort of thought about this to give a little example, to sort of show people that appearances are not always what they seem. And I sort of have given a little example in the past, just to observe lightning. Now, whenever we see lightning in a storm, it looks like it comes from the clouds down to the earth. But in actual fact, just the opposite is what happens. The electrical charge, it may surprise me, the electrical charge actually comes from the earth up to the clouds. But why you see the optical illusion is because the atmosphere is thinner near the clouds and more dense near the ground. So the electrical charge, as it passes up from the earth, heats the thinner atmosphere quicker and progressively slower as it comes to the earth. So you get this optical illusion that the charge comes from the clouds down to the earth, but it's an illusion. The charge comes from the earth to the clouds, but your observation would tell you otherwise. And so we're trying to give that as a little example so that people start to realize that just because you see a certain thing, it can be very misleading. And that's a prime example.
Wow. So let me just see if I understand that correctly, because I'm taken back by surprise with what you just said about lightning. I need to brush up on my physics knowledge.
Okay.
But it seems that what you're saying is that the lightning actually doesn't come from the sky down to the ground. It goes the opposite direction, but we see it as if it's coming down to the ground because it basically heats up the air quicker in the upper atmosphere because there's less air to heat up.
Yes.
Right. So we see the light from that heat first.
Yes.
And so it's just like if you had, two pots of water and one pot had a gallon of water and one pot had a pint of water, the pint would boil first.
Sure. That's
right?
exactly it. That's exactly it.
Wow, that's amazing. So we can really observe something and without very, very careful scrutiny can be completely fooled as to the explanation of what we're seeing.
Yeah.
Or even the nature of what we're seeing. Exactly.
Yes. And contagion stroke infection is exactly that. An observation is made and a false conclusion is drawn from that because people aren't aware of all the facts that actually could cause it.
Right. Isn't the reason for Koch's postulates to make sure that we don't have these kinds of errors in our reasoning when we're figuring out the cause of disease, right? And
Yes.
so just to summarize about Koch's postulates, so I believe there's actually 4 postulates,
Yes.
right? And this is the requirement from Robert Koch, a famous German scientist who is a proponent of germ theory. And in fact, even in Germany now, they have the Robert Koch Institute. It's the most prestigious scientific establishment studying medically related science, right? And those
Sure.
postulates, the first one, which is just that sick people have this germ and healthy people don't have it.
Yeah.
Just that first one has not even been satisfied for any infectious disease.
Absolutely.
So we don't even need the other 3 because the first one, the most basic one, has not been satisfied.
Yeah.
That's what we concentrated in the book because that one follows complete logic, and if that one fails, as you say, the other 3 are pretty much irrelevant because but even at the time of Robert Koch, even even his experiments didn't fulfill those postulates. No so-called infectious disease has actually fulfilled those postulates. There's just nothing.
Wow, this is so mind-blowing because you know that almost the entire foundation and paradigm of modern allopathic medicine is based on germ theory. And there's a good reason why it's called germ theory and not germ law, right?
Yes.
Or germ fact, because as you're saying, there's actually no experimental evidence to support it in any way.
Yeah.
Right. And wasn't there even one scientist who took this a step further and swallowed a really dangerous or allegedly dangerous germ?
Yes. Max Pettenkofer. I'm not quite sure how it's pronounced, but yes, no, I mean, there's some people say it's just a sort of urban myth, but it certainly
it is documented.
Yes, exactly. It's documented. In fact, in a couple of occasions in his class, in front of his students, he swallowed a beaker of so-called cholera bacteria. Yeah, and absolutely didn't suffer. So yes, but since. As I said, since those times, but I mean, more and more investigations of the nature of bacteria and what they actually do. There are at least as many bacteria in the body as cells, or approximately, or it's been approximated that, about the same kind of number, which is...
Really? I thought there were 10
Yes.
10 times as many.
Yes, I've seen variations, but there are certainly a similar number, so
Okay.
which are tens of trillions of so plenty of bacteria, and it's even admitted that only a few of them are potentially dangerous. But part of the role of the rest of them apparently is to protect the body from these dangerous ones. So if they're supposed,
I don't think we necessarily accept that, though.
no, we don't accept that. But again, it's the whole idea that the bad bacteria are just there's just a few of them. There are only a few of them that are bad, and the rest of them are good. So why don't the good ones outnumber? Well, that they outnumber them, but why don't they overwhelm them? But again, it's completely misunderstanding the role of bacteria, or the functions in the body. I mean, they have extremely beneficial functions, and one of them is that they're saprotrophic. That they're part of the decomposition of dead and dying material from the body. So they are not just in the gut, but everywhere. So you'll find them everywhere. They are essential for the cleanup process.
Well,
getting
rid
of
life on Earth. They're essential for life on Earth.
Right.
Life wouldn't exist without them.
And certainly the human body, life. The living organism of the body.
Right.
We need them.
And a lot of the various chemicals and toxins that we're exposed to in modern life actually are deadly for those bacteria, aren't they? Like glyphosate is a great example of this, because bacteria are closely related to plants in much of their chemistry. And the chemical pathway that glyphosate, which is Roundup, works on, is actually conserved. So it's the same pathway in bacteria and plants. So when you eat foods that have been doused with glyphosate, and it, by the way, it penetrates into the flesh of the fruits and vegetables. It's not something that you can just wash off and completely get rid of. So you're basically killing the bacteria in your gut and perhaps elsewhere in your body by that, right? And this disrupts our normal physiologic functioning, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And of course, in the book, we describe these things in detail so that people can understand. It's a bit like a detective story. So we do sort of encourage people to start at the beginning and read through to the end, so that they're in no doubt as to the lack of science, and not only the lack of science to prove what the medical establishment says, but to give more plausible reasons, much more plausible reasons, for why these various diseases, because we looked at it in not only humans, but also in animals as well, to see whether the things like, we had a big thing in the UK with what was commonly called mad cow disease, and we investigated that to see what it was. And we're able to find that in the UK, it was down to the UK government's insistence that the farmers, when they dipped their cattle, used very high dosed organophosphates, which attack the central nervous system of the cows. Hence, they appeared to go mad and die.
Because the wash was put on their neck, so obviously it seeped into their brains.
Wow, this is incredible. This is particularly important for my clinical work, because I often actually recommend that people eat cow brain as a nutritional supplement to help them repair nervous tissue that may be damaged. And actually, it's quite effective. But it's hard to acquire because there are regulations based upon this myth of mad cow disease. So for example, a friend of mine that wanted to try this, he went to a butcher and asked about it, and the butcher, kind of said, "This isn't for eating, right?" And he said, "No, I'm doing an anatomy experiment." and that was the only way that he would actually sell it to him.
Well, of course, as I say, there is a danger there, because I know it was particularly prevalent in the UK because of these crazy laws that the government put out, where it was high dose, which didn't appear to happen in any other countries. And that's why it was more prevalent in the UK than it was anywhere else. And this is what we wanted to get to the bottom of, and then we found out why. But of course, because it goes into the central nervous system of the cow, sends them crazy and kills them, there were so-called instances of it happening to people to a lesser extent. Well, obviously people eating that infected meat, poisoned meat, let's give it its correct term, poisoned meat, could ingest some of those organophosphates, which are very toxic, and could then exhibit similar things, certainly become ill. So you have to, for anyone who is going to eat their meat, or certainly cow's brains, would need to be very careful, I would think, to see what the source was, and whether whether those animals had
Right.
been treated with organophosphates. I mean,
Absolutely.
effectively, it was supposed to be for something fairly innocuous. It was, I think it was warble fly, which damages the hides of the cows and makes it less valuable, and it's sold for leather.
I see. So it's an economic reason. It's not a disease that was
Yeah,
causing any real problems to the
correct,
cows,
correct.
right? So this idea we're saying here, like a really scary illness, right? The mad cow disease. People were definitely frightened about that when there were major headlines, and you're saying it's actually not caused by any type of infectious agent, but it's caused by a toxic substance. So
Sure.
have you found evidence of other diseases that we were told were infectious that were actually caused by a toxic substance?
Well, we
All of them.
yeah, yeah. I mean,
Well,
there's
we found the toxic contributory factors for most diseases. We could see that various toxins at different times were involved. But the idea that there's only one cause for one disease is another paradigm that needs to be broken, because it just doesn't fit. There will always be a multiple combination of factors that contribute to different people's illnesses, and for almost every single person will have a different combination, will be exposed to a different combination. And that's why, as David said before, you have to
Wow.
look at each individual person's intake, well, nutritional intake, exposures environmentally, air pollution, things indoors, electromagnetic fields, just
we boiled it down to four, as we explain all
yes.
these things in the book.
Yeah.
I mean, it's very difficult in a relatively short space of time to sort of explain what took us years to put together and write about in 800 pages, and that's leaving lots out. But we do explain it in more detail in the book, and we do explain what the causes of, or we found the causes of illness to be, and of course then you know what to avoid. But I was just going to give what I found interesting, because we looked into dentistry as well. And there's some very interesting things come out of dentistry, and I can't remember the guy's name, but maybe another time, because he did write a book about it.
Not Weston A. Price.
No.
No.
But he'd done
Hal Huggins.
That's it. Say that again.
Hal Huggins.
Hal Huggins,
and
yeah.
Thomas Levy,
An American dentist, with a large practice. And he'd been doing some experimentation. And this particular case that he talked about was a young girl who he was working on, but had been diagnosed with leukemia. And he got permission to take out all her fillings, and which he did. And within a very short space of time, her leukemia had gone. And then he got permission to put her fillings back, which he did, and the leukemia came back. And that was quite an interesting. And that's a documented.
Wow. Well, I hope he took them out the second time.
Yes. but the interesting thing was that when the leukemia went away, the doctor that who was treating her had said, "Oh no, it's nothing to do with the fillings."
And that's
and yet, how I mean, how
much also, how do we treat leukemia today? We basically give people poison, and actually the chemotherapy for leukemia is among the most aggressive, most cytotoxic chemotherapy that exists.
Wow.
Right, because they're trying to the strategy is to come as close as possible to completely obliterating the bone marrow, which is where all of our blood cells are made, and just to leave a few healthy stem cells, hopefully, that can regrow the blood. And I've not seen that strategy be successful in one individual in my personal experience when I used to do that kind of work. But I think another great example to bring up, and this example shows an illness that's thought to be infectious, caused by not just one toxin, but over time there was a shift in the poison that caused the disease. And what I'm talking about is related to the gypsy moth, which was an invasive species brought over from Europe to the United States. And it was kind of devastating because it would completely clear all the foliage off of a common type of tree in the forest. I can't remember which tree, but essentially, and then it would also damage all of the crops in the farm. On the farm, so it was affecting the food supply. So there was like a panic. What are we going to do about this invasive gypsy moth because it had no natural predators? And someone came up with this idea of using lead arsenate, right, which has both arsenic and lead. And I think everybody knows now that those are very poisonous metals, right? And we all think of arsenic as something that can be used to poison someone like in a homicide, right? Because there's literature about that, right? Arsenic and old lace. So we're very familiar with this. But at that time, people were mixing up solutions of this, in their backyard with a hose. They were not using any protective equipment, and they're basically spraying it to cover every tree, everything in their garden, right? All of the summer fruits, so they started spraying every year, in the spring, right? And then we started seeing this huge epidemic of poliomyelitis, right? And I want to clarify that the term poliomyelitis actually is not the name of a virus. It's the name of a specific type of lesion in the spinal cord. And if someone dies from this condition, you can actually dissect their spinal cord and look under a microscope and see a very specific type of damage that's been labeled as poliomyelitis, and can be easily recognized as the cause of this illness, which causes paralysis is the main thing, and it can be progressive and can cause your breathing muscles to not work anymore, right? And we all remember stories about the iron lungs that were trying to get people through that. So there is a very strong correlation to the spraying and the prevalence of that disease. And this continued for quite a while, and ultimately was not successful at removing the invasive moth, by the way. But at some point, they realized that it was either not successful or that it was causing some kind of damage. And a new chemical had been invented called DDT.
Yep.
And so they switched from lead arsenate to DDT, and then the cases of poliomyelitis continued, but actually there was a slight change in the clinical pattern of how people were sick, right?
Yeah.
So you have all this evidence of the timing of it, and then polio was a season. It was like only in the summer were kids getting paralyzed, right? And of course, kids are more vulnerable to poisons because they have less body mass to spread it around in. Right, and they also may have smaller livers to detoxify. Not that your body's not able to really handle metals, because we really don't. We're not exposed to metals very much in the natural world. This is really a byproduct of the Industrial Revolution, right? So it's very devastating. So you see basically this pattern of one poison causing the illness and then switching to another poison, because, with DDT, there are all these stories that kids playing in the summer, when the trucks came by to spray DDT, that they would actually go in the spray and they were encouraged to by their families, right? Because it was going to protect them from getting some kind of disease or something, and meanwhile it was actually causing the disease.
Yeah,
yes, we do cover the polio, DDT, lead arsenate. Yes, that's sort of covered in the book.
It's all in there.
Yes. Have you read Silent Spring?
Of course, Rachel Carson. I read that in college.
Yeah.
Yes.
And
so that's quite a hard read, but I mean, such an important piece of work to put out there, and yet they absolutely vilified her. Dreadful. What?
Right, and look what the environmental movement has become. It's been focused on things that aren't really affecting our health. Right, when meanwhile all of the companies are still able to dump all these poisons, everywhere, and many of them are unregulated at all. Like there's a pesticide called atrazine that has been shown to, when like frogs and amphibians are exposed to it, they become hermaphrodites, meaning they have both male and female genitalia, right? So this is just one example of a pretty potent chemical that is a endocrine mimicker. So it mimics sex hormones for us and causes perturbations of sexual development. And this is not regulated at all in the United States. The EPA said there was insufficient evidence to regulate this drug. And so you can use it, at your will and spread it around everywhere. So if we started to investigate this in the mainstream and saw that it's actually these poisons and toxins we're exposed to that are causing the illness, boy, there would be a lot of anger and protest among the general public, wouldn't there?
Well, this is it. And of course, this is the problem. And we're seeing a prime example of it now with the coronavirus scare, is just how complicit the mainstream media is in the in the fraud, really. You imagine if the mainstream media wasn't covering this coronavirus thing in the way they are, with all the scare stories on a almost 24-hour basis, day by day, it wouldn't have been nearly as successful from the government's point of view of this lockdown, which they've locked down practically the world. Putting companies out of business, putting people out of jobs, high rates of suicide, all based basically on a lie. We're quite convinced with our studies of the nonsense behind viruses causing these diseases. So we know that the basis of that story cannot be true. So if people are getting ill, and that's a big if, because if there are people getting ill, then it's for some other reason. But I don't believe anything like those numbers can be true. And I did start having a look at, just for the UK, where the government publishes year on year, month on month, the death rates,
Right.
total death rates in the UK. And you can see no change, so there's no spikes. And I shall keep watching that throughout this year. But because it stays fairly constant around, year in, year out. And if there's going to be some pandemic, as we're told, then you would expect to see spikes in that. But there isn't anything. There's nothing showing so far.
Yeah, well, I've looked at some of those data sources as well. I've seen the one from the UK government, and there's another one that looks at a bigger section of Europe called MOMO.
Yes.
Right. And so what they're looking at is called excess mortality. So in other words, so far in 2020, are more people dead this year than the average for any given year. Right. And this is a really important thing to monitor, because if there is some new type of illness that comes about, right, this is how we're going to capture it. That you're going to see an increase in total deaths. And then, that would be a signal to start investigating what could be causing it. And so this year, we're not seeing any spike like that at all. And I want to give some important numbers, because we're talking about, poisons and toxins being a major cause of illness, and most likely the explanation for virtually all of the diseases that we are told are infections, right? Specifically, and I'm sure also cancers. But if we look at the actual number of people who are dying from other things like pharmaceutical prescription drugs. Now, there was a study, and this is in the Journal of the American Medical Association, so this is not from a fringe research group at all. This is a very, very mainstream article. Of course, it didn't get any of the media coverage like this virus is, but it concluded that 128,000 people every year in the United States die from using prescription drugs as directed. So these are not people who took an overdose or who made a major mistake and, took 3 pills instead of 1. These are people who are actually following the instructions, and they die from the drugs. And, in my opinion, many of these drugs are poisons.
Oh,
right. And of course, that's why they would kill so many people. And that number just in the United States is just an order of magnitude higher than the total number of deaths worldwide from this corona, that are blamed on this coronavirus.
Yes.
I agree with you that I've looked carefully at the papers alleging that this virus causes disease, and they once again have not satisfied Koch's first postulate at all. In fact, they haven't even directly isolated and purified any viral particle from people who are sick. They have to mix it with cells. And so I've seen two experiments. One, they mixed it with lung cancer cells, and lung cancer cells are sick and exhibit a lot of properties of disease. And so how do you know the particles don't come from the lung cancer cells?
Yeah.
And then the other experiment used what's called Vero cells, which are derived from the monkey kidneys. And so those would be healthy cells, but what did they do? They added multiple antibiotics to it, which are toxic to those cells, right? So basically you're creating toxic cells, and then who knows what the toxic cells put out. What I think is actually that they put out exosomes, which are our body's own way of protecting against a toxic exposure, that we put out these little sacs of fluid that contain some genetic material. And they've been demonstrated actually to be able to gobble up poisons and toxins. And they also signal other parts of our body to be on the lookout, or to send out the disposal team, or perhaps even to send out bacteria to clean it up, right? And
Yep.
so every experiment that I've seen where they claim to have isolated the virus, they've basically put it in a culture medium which is specifically designed to put out these exosomes. And the exosomes, and if you look at the electron microscope, right, like I've showed in my presentation, they are virtually identical in appearance.
Sure.
Right? So, but the thing is, if there are actually any deaths from any new illness, no one is looking into investigating what the cause of that could be, because they've said that it's the virus based on this very, very weak scientific data.
Yeah.
Yes, they won't be doing toxicological tests. Well, they just don't, because they don't want to look for toxins.
No, I think most people who've looked into this, and also, what shall we say, the wider political agenda, without wanting to sound like a conspiracy theorist, I think if people look into what's been going on for a long time now, many decades, they'll realize there has to be some other agenda behind this, because no way could the governments of the world, and this is in the UK, everywhere, have been able to bring in these so-called emergency measures with very draconian and restrictive laws, which they've done, of locking people down in their homes and sort of arresting people if they appear to have gone out to see their children who live in another house on ridiculous pretenses. They wouldn't have been able to bring these things in without something, what they've done, where they've said, oh, we're only doing it to protect everyone because there's this deadly disease around. They'd never have got away with it. So it's a perfect vehicle for them,
right,
to do what they've done. And I think the more we look into this and the more the truth comes out, they'll see what's really behind this so-called pandemic. And I do say so-called. I think the only pandemic there is in misrepresentation and bad testing.
Right, absolutely. So, Dawn and David, I think we've covered quite a bit of material. We've given a big overview, right, of everything basically related to infectious disease, and we've spoken our opinions, the conclusions that we've come to, that there's actually not even shaky evidence, but there's really no clear evidence to support even the first of Koch's postulates that any so-called microorganism infectious agent causes any disease. And I want to once again refer all the viewers to this excellent book, which in addition to laying out all of this, is extremely well referenced with its bibliography and footnotes, so that those people that want to look directly at the scientific papers themselves will be able to find out where the information's from. Because I know there's a lot of researchers out here listening to this, and they may not have looked into some of this biological and medical science, and this is a new area. So it's really such a great thing that you've indexed this so well that they can find the sources in the material. So do you have any final remarks? And also please take the opportunity to tell the listeners where they can find you.
Okay, well, we have a website, newly formed website, but there is an email address on it. So if people want to, it's nice and easy, because it's just whatreallymakesyouill.com. So and they can find us on there, and there's an email address that they can write to if they want to ask us some questions. But I hasten to add, it's not a medical service. We would we don't want people to write to us and say, well, I've got this pain in my leg. No, I jest. But we hope that people will read the book, and then if there's something they don't understand, to contact us about that. They can get the book from any Amazon site, and they can buy it in either the paperback version, which you showed there, or they can get an ebook.
Can people buy the book directly from your website?
No. We deliberately steer clear of that and let Amazon take the stress of sort of orders and deliveries. That's down to them. They are quite good at it. Although we've had a few people not complaining about us, but complaining about Amazon, because under this present manufactured crisis, they're saying, well, we have to give priorities to other things. So people are getting slightly longer delays in the delivery of their books.
Right. Well, you could see why they might not want people to be reading your book right now.
Exactly.
Especially, right? Because it's going to definitely lead to question the official narrative.
Yeah.
Let me tell people out there that if you are looking for some help with your own medical problems, I do have a consultation service, and please, I encourage you to reach out to me. The contact information will be in the show notes, along with the name of Dawn and David's website, where you can find them, and I'll have a link to their book as well. So I want to thank everyone for tuning in. As always, please click the like button below, and please come back for more shows. We've got some additional exciting shows coming up on Medicamentum Authentica. Thank you.
Thank you.